Welcome to Press On Podcast with Mike Woodruff, where Mike and invited guests share insights to cultivate a biblical perspective and thoughtful resilience in challenging times.
Welcome back to the Press On Podcast. Today, it is my pleasure and privilege to chat with Collin Hanson. Collin is most recently the author of a biography on Tim Keller, which I have right here. Did this come out in another copy a little while ago? It seems like I had a blue copy.
Well, there's an international edition. Maybe you stumbled across one of those.
That's what I got. Okay, so anyway. So he wrote a book most recently on Tim Keller, and he is here. We're recording this on Monday, August 28th. He is here to speak at a Lake Light event. He also has written several other books. Collin is currently the executive vice president of communications.
I am vice president of content and
vice
editor-in-chief.
president of content, editor-in-chief for the Gospel Coalition. He is on staff in various capacities down at Samford University. He previously worked at Christianity Today, graduate of Northwestern in both journalism and in history. So, Collin, thank you for being here.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks, Mike.
So, I'm a fan. I'm a fan of a lot of the work that you do, so thank you for that. I will say it struck me this afternoon as I was scribbling down some questions. I thought, oh, no, I'm interviewing the interviewer. I'm sure that is that sets me up for being critiqued on the questions that I'm asking and other things. But anyway, here we go.
Don't worry about that. I'll be fine.
So I know that tonight Ben is going to ask you a lot of questions about Tim Keller. So I'm going to stay away from that, other than two that I have. And so I had several chances to talk with Dr. Keller over the years, including one that's a God moment that I share just because I had, before we went to multi-site, I was pushing back, and the elders were saying we need to do this, and I didn't want to do it, and whatever. And then there was this push to go to video, and I said, I don't think so. And so everybody else is doing video, and I go, well, you know who's not doing video? Keller's not doing video.
That's true.
And I said, I don't feel like I think we're more like Redeemer than we are other churches that are doing video. I said, I want to go see what Keller does. So I called and I tried through various gatekeepers to say, I just want 5 minutes with the guy. Can I get 5 minutes with the guy? I promise you, I'm not weird, whatever.
I'm not crazy.
They said no. So I went anyway, and I went to several services in the morning, and then I was walking through Central Park, and literally I've got some time to kill because I'm going to go to a Sunday evening service. I'm walking through Central Park, and who is walking next to me? Tim Keller.
You couldn't miss him.
No, you couldn't miss him. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And I look at him and I go, Dr. Keller, I was here to talk with you, but nobody would let me get close. So I said, can I ask you some questions? And I'm figuring out he doesn't want groupies. He didn't strike me as the kind that warmed to groupies. So anyway, he said, I've got a 15-minute walk. I'm glad to chat while I'm walking. And so I just was like, okay, Lord, New York City's a big place. This was a fun
that
little
is amazing.
rendezvous. Yeah.
I love that. That's great.
So anyway, all that to say, I've not had a crisis of faith by God's grace, but I've had a crisis of faith in the church. I've had moments of frustration and doubt about pastors. And about 10 years ago, I started asking people, I said, does anybody know the pastor of a large church that they would want as a neighbor? And I said, because I've been close to a lot of these people, and I don't think I'd want them as a neighbor, and I don't think I'd want me as a neighbor. I said, I'm a pretty busy guy. I don't show up at home with a lot of emotional energy for neighbors. And I said, I really want to think that, Rick Warren is half as happy as he acts, and that that Tim Keller is a really nice guy, but I've been around some of the others and I go, no. So I don't want you to let me down here, but would Tim Keller have been a good neighbor?
Well, I think Tim Keller definitely would have been a good neighbor, but just with his personality, he would have been the kind of neighbor who would be great if you really wanted to talk about the deep, meaningful things of life. He wasn't really a small talk guy. He wasn't really a hobbies guy. The things that he preached about tended to be the things that he really cared about. He cared about the Bible. He cared about theology. He cared about the church around the world. So, yeah, he would definitely be a great neighbor in the sense that he would talk to you about Jesus. I'm not sure. I don't know if I have a lot of stories about him taking out other people's garbage or, coming by.
Yeah.
But then again, that was in New York City, in Hopewell. He was very much a good neighbor in that classic sense that we expect of pastors or have expected of pastors. He was everywhere. He was at the Sweet 16 parties. It was if somebody died in the middle of the night, he was at the family's home to be able to help deliver the news and to comfort them. He was everywhere. He was doing 4 premarital counseling sessions at one, or actually marriage crisis interventions at the same time. One of his best friends who spoke at the memorial just this month was a guy who just wandered into the church saying, "My marriage is a wreck. My life is falling apart. Can you help?" And they sat down. So in the sense that we think of pastors as being good neighbors because we can bring to them our deepest concerns and hopes and fears, he was a great neighbor. If you wanted somebody to small talk about the Yankees, that wasn't Tim. That wasn't Tim.
Well, yeah. Okay. That's great. That's encouraging. Do you think, I know that there's all the story about him at Hopewell and then in Manhattan, in such a contrast. I assume the fact that he did Hopewell in Manhattan means that he could have done Birmingham, Alabama.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. So the thing about Tim is that he was uniquely gifted at understanding the cultural dynamics of ministry, not just what we think of as contextualization, but the strengths and weaknesses. He would come visit in Birmingham when I would invite him. He spoke a number of times. He did a number of fundraisers in Birmingham, and he'd come in and right away he's asking me, "What's the significance of the tower, the Vulcan statue that you have here? And what about the Temple of Vesta over here? What does that tell you about your city?" So he was just incredibly curious about different places. And so if he had been in Lake Forest or Birmingham, Alabama, he would immediately have been looking around, almost that Acts 17 sense of, what do these people worship? What makes them tick? You're just an incredibly curious person about cultures. And so I do think he would have been effective. Now, there was one time when I was in...
I think if he's going to be in Birmingham, he's going to have to be a Roll Tide fan. I have a hard time seeing that.
We could choose Auburn, and we'd put up with that, I guess. But I did talk with somebody at one point, and they said, and I said, "Well, I don't know if Tim's going to visit for this." And they said, "Well, I suppose it's okay. He is pretty boring." That actually happened to him at the Leadership Summit here in Chicago. One of my friends was here. He's a pastor in South Dakota, and he said, "I loved every speaker except for that really boring guy." There was a sense in which you did have to care about ideas at a certain level. But to qualify that a little bit, when he went back for the 25th anniversary of his ordination, he went back to Hopewell, Virginia, there wasn't a single person who talked about anything he taught. He was an incredibly effective teacher, but it was all about the kind of person that he was around them, the things that he did with them and for them, being part of that community. And that became the foundation of his basic perspective that in some places, when I was living in Evanston, I saw this as well. Some places, the way you love people is by showing up with a truck. In other places, the way you love people is by handing them the card of your therapist. Or some people will listen to you teach and then they'll open up. Some people will never be interested in that. They don't care what you have to teach, but they'll listen if you love them.
Right.
It works both ways. And
I heard him say that. He said some people, you follow them, their leadership because they're preaching. Other people, you let them preach because they're in your life and you love them.
And that was the basic difference between those two places. So maybe if he were in Birmingham, he might have had to have been a little bit more animated, perhaps. I'm not really sure. But I think what we love about Tim in part is that wherever he was basically the same person. There wasn't a radical shift, I think, as you see in my book. There was not some sort of radical personality shift. The people who knew him from that beginning, they recognized him all the way through his life.
Yep. Well, let me, I know you're going to talk a lot about Tim tonight, so let me pivot and say you are a cultural apologetics guy. I see that you're teaching these classes. You're leading the center for Keller. So, what is cultural apologetics? What is it that you're teaching? And you might want to start just for all our listeners. What is apologetics,
Sure.
and then how does cultural apologetics differ? And then, I guess I'm also going to ask you, how has cultural apologetics changed in the last 5 years, or where do you think it's going to go in the next 5?
Yeah, so I think when a lot of people think about apologetics, it's defending the faith. That's the basic idea. It's been there from the very beginning. You can see Jesus engaged in all sorts of different apologetics, defending his teaching as he was arguing with the Pharisees. Paul did this not only in Acts 17, as we talked about there. That was very much a cultural apologetic, connecting with what they were seeing in the world around them. But he engaged in other kinds of apologetics as well, rational arguments. I think that's what we mostly think. We think of arguments and proofs and debates and things like that. I think what makes cultural apologetics a little bit different is it's both narrower and smaller than that. Here's what I mean by smaller. I actually studied kind of a variation on this when I was a student at Trinity, Evangelical Divinity School. I studied with Kevin Van Hooser. He taught a number of my classes, and one of them was on cultural hermeneutics. And we studied marketing. We studied marketing to understand how our message is communicated and what does it tell us about the audiences that we're teaching to based on what marketers are saying, not because we're marketers, but because we have to understand a world in which all of us are being marketed to so much. That's kind of the smaller thing. We're looking for the messages of culture. The bigger thing is actually going all the way back to Augustine's City of God. You've got an environment there in the late early 4th century or 5th century, and the Roman Empire is falling apart. And non-Christians are saying, pagans, they're saying, this never would have happened if it hadn't been for the Christians. So Augustine comes with this massive world historical defense to say, no. Here's what was wrong with the Roman Empire based on what we understand as Christians about how the world works, how the world's made. And here's how Christians are not responsible for that. And also, here's what you could understand about the world if you followed the Christian faith. That's where he sets up the city of God versus the city of man and things like that. So what we're trying to do at the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics is more similar to what Augustine was doing with City of God. We're trying to equip Christians, whether they're pastors or professors or just parents, to understand the big stories of what's happening in our world. Sometimes things are shifting quickly because of technology. Sometimes they're shifting over the course of centuries. But we're trying to equip people at all those different levels to simply understand more broadly what's happening. Maybe one quick way to do it, James Davison Hunter is a sociologist at the University of Virginia, was a longtime collaborator with Tim Keller. I was talking to him in 2016, I think, and I was asking about politics. And he said, that's fine. You can ask me about politics. You got to understand, I'm not a weatherman. I'm a climatologist. I talk to you about, long-term, decades-long, centuries-long trends, not what's being reported on the news. And the way Tim and I thought about putting this together, we thought we need to become better climatologists in the church. Not just looking at the weather, is it going to be sunny or rainy tomorrow, but what has been changing over the course of years and decades or even centuries. That's what cultural apologetics does.
I had a chance in late September of 2001 to interview Martin Marty.
Yeah. Great.
The interview had been set up before. We were going to talk about the history of campus ministry. Now the world has changed.
Yeah.
So I asked him, I said, I want to ask you different questions, right? And he goes, fine, let's go wherever you want to go. And I said, so the churches have been packed the last few weeks. Are they going to stay packed?
Yeah.
And he said, no, if I'm right, what happened was an earthquake pay attention to glaciers. And he
Yeah.
said, after an earthquake, everybody gets up and they start putting everything back the way it was. But he said, and everybody talks about it. He goes, meanwhile, nobody talks about glaciers because they move so slowly. But once the glacier has gone through, everything's different. And he said, I've made my mark by studying glaciers, not earthquakes. Don't be distracted. And I thought that was just a great.
I'm going to use that, Mike, and I'm
you
going to
go.
credit you.
Well, you can credit me, but it was Martin Marty who used it.
It's the exact same idea. Many of the things that are most important in our lives are the things that we don't pay attention to. Cultural apologetics is trying to surface those assumptions, and it's often things that Christians even can be mistaken notions that Christians share with non-Christians, because that's the power of culture. It's the stuff that you don't have to explain. It's the stuff that everybody just already assumes.
Yes, right.
We're trying to surface those assumptions and expose them with the light of Christ to find out what's good and what needs to be changed.
Okay, so 5 years ago, you've been teaching at Samford for how long? BC Divinity
For a
School?
couple years. Yeah,
Okay.
I've been there for about a decade, but teaching the last couple of years.
So are there things that you are teaching about or writing about now that are new and different from 5 or 10 years ago?
Well, kind of the whole premise of what I teach. So this is the way it works with cultural apologetics that I teach in a classroom versus what we do at the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. What I tell people all the time is you sit in my classroom and we will talk about transgender stuff. We will talk about race and racism and justice. We will talk about politics. It's a lot of the stuff that you don't always get training with in seminary, but you will have to address. You will have to contend with one way or another. You'll have to engage with. That's what I do in the classroom. But the thing is, as you just pointed out, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, a lot of the issues change. Now, the underlying things may be the same, and that's what we're trying to expose, but the different kind of, just points of those glaciers that stick up might be exposed at different times based on that climate change, to give an example. So what we do at the Keller Center is that we will do occasional courses bringing people up to speed on all sorts of different topics. So for example, one of them that we're working on now is one on the great dechurching, which I think we'll probably talk about here. Just why are things diminishing right now in the church? Another thing I do, I would say is very different. This will be the most concrete example. In my podcast that I do called Gospel Bound, the first episode is going to be with Jean Twenge. Jean Twenge is a sociologist at the San Diego State University. She's got a great new book called Generations. She takes a basically technological analysis of the difference in generations, specifically the effect of smartphones and the attendant theology, or not theology, but technology, on how it changes generations and how they relate to one another. There are pretty extreme consequences for our families, for the workplace, and for the church in these generational differences that are largely driven by technology. That's the kind of thing that we want to address in an ever-changing environment, especially to help parents make wise decisions, to help pastors to understand how to lead in that environment, what to emphasize, to help professors to know what to focus on in terms of all kinds of things, including marketing and how that plays into this. So we work on all those kinds of stuff, but then we're also at the same time saying so many things are downstream from things that happened 300 years ago. So
Right.
Those are the two levels that we're working on.
Okay, so Collin, you were
Just
interested
tossing out a lot of stuff.
You're interested in so many different things. I'm trying to. So I guess I'll just sort of scribble in the margins here. The generational study. So 25 years ago, I did an article for Young Life magazine trying to look at different generational trends.
Yep.
And I felt like I got my hand slapped because it was very superficial sociology, which it was. It was all sort of anecdotal, but saying, hey, look, if you grew up here, the greatest generation as opposed to the boomers, as opposed to, we called them the Xers at the time, and then, millennials and on through. And just trying to say, this was your war, this was your technology, this were your TV shows. Look at how different these things are. But it didn't. The responses that I got to that were not positive. Let's say that. But now I have this sense that big data is going to come in and is really going to change generational studies. Is that? Is that your sense of things?
That's definitely what you see with Twangy's work. I mean, she is pulling from massive studies, and not just one study, but dozens of studies together. I mean, again, this is part of marketing. There's a lot of people out there who are doing this professionally for a living, and you see some very clear shifts. I mean, here, let me just give you a quick example of this. This is what we're talking about with cultural apologetics. So on this book, The Great Dechurching, one of the sociologists who's worked on the book is Ryan Burge. He's also a pastor in Illinois. And he made a comment today saying, look at every trend on moral issues that evangelical Christians often talk about, from same-sex marriage to abortion to drugs to all kinds of different things. In 20 years, every one of those issues has gone way far away from Christians. Like way far away, like dramatic shift. And the shifts are even more pronounced the younger the generation gets. So he then asks a question of, what is happening in our churches? Like even people in our churches who love their pastors just are not agreeing with what's being taught. Immediately, my mind starts to kick into gear to say, this is what I mean about some of the generational challenges. Young people, and you can see this all over the place, are growing up in a world, talking about Gen Z here specifically, so we're talking like mid-20s down. They're growing up in a world where all of the different influences of their lives do not allow them to even conceive of a world where there are only two genders. It just doesn't make sense. It's not that it's just like that's a complete flip from older generations, including me as an older millennial. That's a world where you wouldn't have even thought otherwise. One generation later, it's incomprehensible that there could be two genders. There's all kinds of different reasons that we could speculate about or that we could actually identify for why that's shifted. But there's no doubt that technology has played a massive role in why that shifted in one generation. But then the question I want to bring back to church leaders is simply to say, this is a challenge that we can't afford to simply ignore. We're trying to teach these things. We're trying to disciple, but whatever we're doing is not powerful. I mean, it is. It's the Holy Spirit, so it should have all the power in the world, but it doesn't seem to be penetrating how people actually think about a lot of things. That's a major discipleship challenge, but let me just briefly say something of why this is hard. We're moving away from a time when your primary orientation to information was sitting in positions where somebody else was in a position of authority over you, including the church. But now the authority is each person with the smartphone in their pockets, and then with an algorithm that serves up whatever they find on TikTok. That's a different frame of reference that younger generations contend with that I never saw. I mean, I basically got my first little smartphone when I was here at Northwestern in Evanston. It was just a different world then. And these are the kind of changes that we have to be attendant to, not panicked about, but they make big differences of why generations, even in the same church, have a hard time understanding each other.
So let me go to the Great Dechurching. So I got this book sitting in front of us for those that are watching, and you guys commissioned this, and big study. As I understand it, 3 different waves of studies.
Yeah, largest ever studies on why people have left the church.
Well, why don't you give us the 2-minute overview of what you found?
Well, 2-minute overview is simply, this is the largest and most dramatic religious change in American history. 40 million Americans have left the church in about the last 30 years. That's the headline right there. A lot of people sense the culture's changed, something's different. This is the verification. Yes, this has happened. It's the most dramatic you've ever seen. They don't go to church.
They don't go to church. They used to go to church and they don't go to church.
Exactly. This is not people who have never been in the church. No, these are people who, I used to be Catholic and I would go to Mass. Now I don't. Right. I used to be Methodist. I'd go to church. Now I don't do that anymore. These are self-consciously
de-churched. They used to go to church almost every week, and now they go to church less than twice a year.
Well, see, now that's, yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. Because the church attendance rate overall is is way down. A regular churchgoer now is somebody that we expect to attend maybe twice a month.
Right.
That used to be 4, and then it was 3, and now it's down to 2. So these are people who are attending far less. I mean, yeah, you're talking maybe once every couple years or 2 years, something like that.
So but you guys,
Yeah.
Burge in particular, I think he was the stats guy.
Right.
And
That's right.
And you broke them out into 4 different groups.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the interesting thing is that, I mean, they all have different characteristics in terms of somebody who leaves the Catholic Church is often different from somebody who leaves the mainline church versus somebody who leaves an evangelical church versus somebody who might actually still hold evangelical beliefs, but is actually not in church at all anymore. So the whole thing of why somebody leaves the church, we want to come up with one narrative that explains everything, one explanation, this is why. And it tends to kind of follow political lines. You know, the left will often say, well, they've left because evangelicals are so hypocritical. And then the right says, no, they're leaving because the left has become so secular. The reality is most people leave the church, whatever tradition, for rather mundane reasons. There was a divorce, or we just stopped going, or life got busy, or my kids grew up.
Sports programs on Sunday morning, and we just never went back. Yeah.
Exactly. And then we just sort of drifted away, and nobody reached out, and we got out of the habit, and we worried about, well, I don't know if we can re-engage at this point. So that's kind of it's one of the major findings on the positive side. One of the major findings of the book is that most of them would be willing to come back, but they need somebody to invite them and to encourage them. So there's a very hopeful side of things. It's actually in some ways not, the problem is bigger, but the solutions are easier, I think, than a lot of people would expect. They're multi-causal, but they're as simple as churches being attentive to basic relational wisdom of walking with people, especially, and this is a challenge in a place like Lake Forest. Most of the people who are leaving the church are not highly educated people who are walking through the different institutions of life. It's mostly lower educated people who have fallen away from everything in life. They've fallen off the ladder of life.
The institutions are collapsing around them.
It's not just the church.
Right. And one of the tragedies, and I had this conversation with a friend a little while ago. I said, like many who are on the, who identify, on the left, you live a very conservative life.
Yes. Oh,
And
this is one of the things I talk about all the time. Yes.
I said, I just want to point out that the life you're selling doesn't work. The life you're living works really well, but it's not the life that you're advocating.
It's the sociologist Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia who makes this point, I think, most powerfully. He's got a book coming out, I think it's next year, called Get Married. But the idea is that the left promulgates ideology that they don't practice.
The successful left, the elite left, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So both political parties are always fascinating amalgamations of all different kinds of people. So the left tends to have the most highly educated and the least educated in the same broad group. But you're right. If you're talking about the folks on the North Shore of Chicago, they tend to be the folks who are least likely to get divorced.
Right.
Most likely to invest a lot in their kids because they understand what Wilcox and others describe as the success sequence. It's virtually impossible for you to experience poverty in America if you will work and then get married and then have kids.
Right. The success sequence.
Sex sequence in that order. It's virtually impossible. It doesn't matter your race, your class, your income. If you do that, and that tends to be what elites in America on the left and right know, that there's a pattern to that. And that's one reason why they tend to kind of quote unquote succeed in life. But then they turn around and tell everybody else it doesn't matter. Right. And then things fall apart and we wonder why.
Right.
Yeah.
By the way, I know you've been traveling. Do you know that Nicholas Kristof has an article on?
I did see that, yes. Yeah.
Well, so thank you for the great de-churching. I have other books here, but I'm not going to go there. I guess I want to ask you. I will come we'll
Okay,
come to
you'll
this
come back
in the
to
end.
it. Okay,
But
good.
I want to ask you. So you have a history degree from Northwestern, and you have a journalism degree.
Mm-hmm.
So I am increasingly distressed about journalism, about the media, about the
Me too.
whatever we want to call it.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking here big terms, left, right,
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
the big presses, the papers, the blogs, the social media. So that there's a friend here in the area who worked for the Chicago Tribune for 40 years, retired a few months ago. And 2 years ago, I went to him and I said, okay, here's the deal. I'm going crazy. I'm listening to the right. I'm listening to the left. I'm trying to triangulate. I'm in a bad mood most of the time. I'm yelling at the radio, which is not a good look. And I don't know what to believe. I said, and this was again 2 years ago. I go, what actually did Russia do, and when did they do it with our elections? Is Hunter Biden's laptop a real thing? Am I supposed to believe in that? Is it being buried? I go, I don't know who to trust. And I said, I sort of need some facts here. Yeah. And I don't think I'm asking for too much. Are we going to be able to is the media going to fix itself? Is capitalism going to work? Is that part of what you're trying to do with some of the news sources out there? Yeah. I'm trying to help people stay sane. I'm trying to be the non-anxious presence. Yeah. I'm trying to say, look, we're getting gamed here by some of the algorithms and by some of the desperate attempts to try and keep people listening and clicking. Yeah. But as recently as a few hours ago, I was working on a talk for Lake Light on how to navigate the news, and somebody came back and said, don't tell people they can't trust the news. Don't go down that path. You don't want to be that person. And I'm like, well, no, I don't want to say don't trust the news. We need the news. I believe in the news. I believe we need the fourth estate. Yeah. But I'm a little despairing. So you're a journalism guy.
Man, I don't have any positive news for you, unfortunately. It's a pretty dramatic change when I started as a newspaper major in 1999. It's a pretty dramatic difference in there. Let me just illustrate the difference between then and now. Back in 1999, newspapers were basically at their peak. That's kind of hard to remember, but the peak was very quickly followed by the collapse. It was not some sort of dramatic or kind of slow decline. It was pretty immediate from there. The basic idea is simple. It's the same problem of any institution in the internet age. You don't have any gatekeepers. Okay, so what were you trying to do at a newspaper before? Let's take the Chicago Tribune as an example. You were trying to build the broadest constituency possible to be able to sell advertisements. Mm-hmm. Okay? So you have a vested interest in trying to hold people together at some level, to be completely cynical about it, to sell advertisements, right, to make money in there. Doesn't matter if you're talking about ABC7 or whatever, to TV or newspaper, anything.
My friend
right?
said when he started, he graduated from Harvard in whatever, I think 81, and when he started, he said there were 600 people on staff at the Trib, and 80% of the revenue came from car ads, job ads.
It's classifieds, yeah.
Yeah, the classifieds.
Yeah.
And he said 20% came from subscriptions, and he said we had 600 people. When he retired, I think they were down to 100 people.
Yeah. And the idea was it's not like everybody was sitting down every Sunday morning reading all these detailed accounts of what was happening in Ukraine or what was happening in Russia. They were reading the funny pages, they were reading the sports and things like that. It wasn't fundamentally different, but the business model worked to sort of build the credibility and the respectability through that reporting and through that writing to be able to keep that broad constituency for being able to sell the advertisements in there. And the advertisements, this is the place that you went to go if you were going to find out that, the Jewel Osco, you had to get the coupons in there. So it was all tied together to this whole commercial package. There's a reason why in my class on cultural apologetics, I say that for 70 years, the percentage of people who were affiliated with a church was about 75% in America. In the year 2000, it starts to decline. By 2020, it's at 47%. And I say, what changed in the year 2000? Because I say, you can't talk about something that happened before, because again, it was stable. Was stable until then. It only starts to decline then. You can talk about something afterward. And I say, in the end, I kind of, cut to the chase and say, it's the first year that a majority of Americans had the internet in their homes. We are still at the dawn of the information revolution. We feel like the internet's already taken for granted, but no. We have not really even begun, I think, to understand the transformations that are affected. Here's the difference when it comes to what you can trust in the news. The fact is that group of people trying to build that constituency, they did not always have truth in their best interest either. They covered up all sorts of different things. All you have to do is go back to the Pentagon Papers. Like you can find all kinds of different things.
Yellow journalism, all kinds of.
Like they weren't necessarily doing that. They didn't necessarily have that motivation. But what we've flipped away from is now there are just no gatekeepers. You have some gatekeepers who are trying to build consensus. Now we have no gatekeepers, which also means we have endless bad actors on every side of every issue. And so the information age has affected an epistemic crisis, a crisis of knowledge, and we don't really have solutions yet for that. I wish I could say that there's a solution there, but this is a dramatic problem for pastors because pastors are institution leaders. They're trying to hold everybody together. They're trying to build consensus around a body of truth with people who that doesn't really make sense to them anymore. Right, left, up, down. They're thinking, what's my truth? And my truth is confirmed only negatively. It's not because my side tells the truth. It's because the other side lies. So all we do is we just come in conditioned thinking, I don't know. Let me take one step back here. This will be helpful to explain. The gatekeepers also narrowed the scope of knowledge for us. They took the entire world and they boiled it down to some newspaper pages or to a 30-minute news broadcast or whatever. Now we are adrift.
24/7.
We're adrift 24/7. It's everywhere. So here's what happens. It makes the problem worse because no human being was ever created to have to think about as many things as we have to think about. And you can't possibly say, what about Ukraine? What about Hunter Biden? You can't know. It doesn't matter how much you read, you can't know what really happened there. So what do people do? They do the very human thing. This is human nature. They outsource their thinking to someone else, and that someone else just games the system negatively. There's no coherence to it. They just say, well, I will just tell you that person or that side is always lying. And so we don't think about anything. We just say, oh, that person that I trust because they hate the right people is now my authority. And I just outsource all of my thinking to them. What I try to tell people is narrow the scope of your life. Yes, maybe it's important for you to know what happened with Hunter Biden, but what's more important than you reading about what happened to Hunter Biden is getting to know your neighbors.
Yep.
That's the only solution I can come up with is try to attend to the things that are concrete, personal, historic, ultimately biblical. That's the only thing I can think of is when the world's trying to tell us to care about everything, try to care more about your immediate environment.
Well, so I have just finished writing a book called How Do You Know?
Okay. Well, I should have just asked you.
Well, no, I'm asking you. But because of this crisis of knowing, and because of seeing people who are increasingly being anxious and angry, and discipled by talk radio, and trying to say, I have news rules, and one of them is when I ask people, what do you do when you get up in the morning? And the number of people who say to me, I look on social media. I check the news.
I open up
and I say,
Elon Musk's app. Yeah.
I say, that to me is like injecting poison into my system. Like, I have got to put on the armor of God. I have got to climb into some sort of headspace where I think God is on the throne. He loves me unconditionally. I need to be an agent of his grace today. What is going on? As opposed to what is going on and let that shape my heart.
I think that anxiety is like caffeine. I think, Matt, I could probably put even myself in that category of it's kind of how you wake up is by injecting some of that anxiety. And I don't think we understand
I like
how
my caffeine from Starbucks
I think that's a much
from
better,
whatever.
Well, that's a much better approach. I did just come up with one thing that is a rule of thumb. Maybe this is in your book already. The best people to learn from are the people who are trying to persuade the other side. So during COVID, I had this same problem of I don't know what to trust. And so what I found was the people that I typically associated with the left, if they were critical of other people on the left, I was more likely to trust them.
Right.
So there are actually some tangible writers that I think of, Matt Iglesias here, Nate Silver. Those are the people I trusted, or a Ross Douthat on the right. If you're now I don't just mean somebody who's always critical of their side. That can become, like if you're a David French writing in the New York Times and you're always criticizing conservatives, that becomes its own incentive. But often if you see somebody who is at cost to themselves, arguing with people they agree with, generally on ideology, it tends to indicate a measure of integrity with them.
Right. So
there are ways to do that.
You're a historian.
Yeah.
The hermeneutic of embarrassment.
Yeah.
Like if somebody is conceding a point, so yes, the Cubs are behind the Brewers, but they're a better team. Okay, all I know is that the Cubs are behind the Brewers.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I know.
That's right.
That's what I've established. And
That's
of course, I take great encouragement from the hermeneutic of embarrassment because the Romans and the Jews admit that the tomb is empty.
Yeah,
right.
That's true.
So they're just trying to explain it. So, okay, what I know is that the tomb is empty.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a great point.
We are starting to run out of time.
Okay.
I want to give you an opportunity.
Okay.
I'm in several pastors groups, and recently the two guys that I spend the most time with were old. And we say to ourselves, it's going to be a really ugly year because we got an election coming up and we're going to try and keep people looking in the right direction and loving and being gracious and learning to listen and doing all of that stuff. But we say, as older pastors, we need to be taking the hits that we wouldn't expect younger pastors to take. But we sort of look at each other and say, wow, it's going to be a hard year.
Yeah, it's talking about 2024.
Yeah, 2024. Yeah. So what would you say to pastors that are saying, I want people to love each other. I want Jesus and the gospel to be so central to who we are that it holds people together who say, really, you're going to vote that way, or you think this way, or you read that book, or you're doing this. And I don't know that there's any other solution than that, but I just say, I sort of, want to say, okay, I need to expect that it's going to be hard and it won't be that hard. And again, these are still in one sense first world problems. No one's throwing us in prison.
We're not being crucified.
We're not being crucified. I'm not getting beat up.
Yeah. Well, here's what I say I think there are many differences between younger and older pastors, but one of the key marks I find of maturity is when you fail and when you realize that you can't make everybody happy and they're not going to like you. Those seem to be key markers in the maturation of a pastor. I think sometimes the conceit of youth is that, well, the reason other people had problems is because they weren't as dedicated, smart, winsome, thoughtful as I am. And you just have to be broken of that. It's the conceit, it's the pride of youth. I've had to go through that. There was a time toward the beginning of the Gospel Coalition where I'd want to read everything everybody said because I just felt like it was my duty to know what everybody was thinking. And then I realized that what people were saying about me was totally divorced from truth or reality, and I couldn't do anything about it. So what are you supposed to do? You just keep trying to stand on the word of truth. You just try to keep focused on the gospel, and you just realize this is what Jesus told us to expect at some level. We were just never told that we're going to be popular. In fact, I did a whole group of books on this for pastors because I found that a lot of younger pastors said, I guess I was wrong about my calling. People don't like me. And I'm thinking, name one of your heroes in history, including Jesus, who was liked.
Yep.
Every single one of them was hated.
We do a lunch for seminary students once a month, and it's called Future Pastors Lunch. I'm just not going to talk about church history or the New Testament or systematics. We'll leave all that stuff, but I'll just talk about what it looks like to run a church. And it's a 2 to 3 year sort of cycle. But one of the lectures that I do, one of the talks that I give, I hand out my email. I've taken all the identifying, markers out, but just the critical email that I'm getting.
Yeah.
And I hand it out to them and I say, I want you to read this because this email is coming to your email box. Yeah. And I said, right now you think I'm a nice guy. People will like me. I'm being
I'm
reasonable.
so smart. They're going to see that.
The last time I did it, one guy started crying.
Oh,
and I said, what's good? He goes, this is so wrong that you got to get this. That people would say this about you. And I said, okay, well, maybe not. But I go, here's the point. This isn't about me. These emails are coming to you.
Yeah.
And you just have to make peace with the fact that people. I actually took pride at one of the emails said that I was the worst pastor in the history of Christendom. And I said, that's actually an accomplishment. I mean, I'm
going down in history.
Wow. Because there have been some pretty bad actors in the past. I said, I'm going to actually hold on to this one. But I do think you're absolutely right. You have to say, my job, and I've said from the pulpit, look, I'm not running for homecoming king, right? And there's times when I'm inclined to do that. My wife will call me out. She goes, you're not running for homecoming king.
But we're not, in fairness, we're not unique in this regard, especially in this day and age.
Everybody gets
the mayor,
right?
The superintendent, the CEO,
yes,
they're all getting the same emails from different people. So,
but I'm reasonable. That's the difference. I'm a nice guy.
Everybody loves pastors, right?
Right. Okay, so I learned this from a podcaster named Collin Hansen. I have a final set of 5 questions.
Here we go.
Yeah, and I can't know. I know some of these are from you, and some of these I made up. But short answers.
Yeah.
What brings you hope?
What brings me hope? Well, I think it's the promises of the gospel. It's the promises of God's word. Like, they don't change, and everything else can change that we've been talking about, but they don't change. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and he knows the outcome of everything, and he tells us what the outcome of everything is. That gives me ultimate hope.
This ends well.
Yeah,
In Jesus, it ends well. What, if anything, keeps you up at night?
Oh, yeah, man. This was one of my best questions I ever asked. Ross Douthat. And
I've heard Ross's answer. I heard you ask Ross.
Yeah, and he's like, politics, the church and everything. My girls and smartphones.
Yep.
And of course, that was years before Jonathan Haidt and all those folks would come. What keeps me up at night is what I was mentioning about the epistemic crisis earlier. Here's what happened. Joe Carter's one of my colleagues. We're both grizzled veterans of media at this point. And we were talking about the difficulty of refuting conspiracy theories. And we were laughing about how crazy this theory was and how anybody could believe it. And then we went back and off the top of our head, we named 20 things that were considered conspiracies at the time that turned out to be true. And we thought, oh, that was before COVID, So it's just it's understandable why things are so confusing now because it's hard to tell what that truth is and how it's motivated. And that's why I gave that technique of often you've got to balance incentives. If somebody has the incentive to lie to you, no matter what they might be saying, it's usually a sign of a problem, which is why the good kind of pastor is the person who preaches the full counsel of God. And if your pastor is offending you sometimes, then I think your pastor is doing the right thing, because that was the thing about Jesus. If you're reading Jesus and you're not offended by something, there's something wrong, because his teaching is hard. His grace is abundant, but his teaching is hard in there. So what keeps me up at night is actually the problem that you mentioned of how do we really know what's going on out there? But you come back to saying, I could trust in the promises of Christ. That's what I know for sure. And he will never fail me, even if I'm wrong about these things.
The podcast, my podcast guest 2 weeks ago was Jared Stacy. I don't know if he's doing a PhD on conspiracy theories.
Really?
In theological ethics.
Wow.
He was a pastor, and he's now doing looking at conspiracy theories in the evangelical church. He's at Edinburgh.
Okay. Oh man, I was just there. I should have checked him up. Anyway,
well,
checked him up.
Okay, question 3. What book, movie, podcast, Netflix series, anything have you recommended more in the last few years than anything else?
Again, I appreciate the research you did here. That's Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind. That's an easy one. Basically how religion and politics define us. Nothing has changed my pastoral ministry, my thinking, except this secular Jewish social psychologist explaining the differences between our intuitions and our reason. Once he unlocked that, all of a sudden, so many experiences made so much sense where I could not understand pastorally. It's actually Jonathan Edwards who helped me with this originally, with his religious affections, of like, why do their actions seem to be so inconsistent with their beliefs? Even in my own life. Why does that happen? And Haidt helps us to see those dynamics of why we often will act according to our tribalistic instincts of wanting to be with a certain group of people. We react instinctively rather than rationally. But our culture values reason, so we tell everybody that it's our reason, but it's actually our intuition. So it's one reason why, as a pastor, people will often come and blame you for something, or it's why Tim Keller said years ago, it was an ask Tim Keller on Twitter, and somebody said, what do you tell young people who are doubting their faith? And he said,
Stop sleeping around?
Said, who are you sleeping with?
Yeah.
Meaning that what we want to do with our bodies, we will then conform our beliefs to justify that. That's just sin nature that we have to war against by the power of the Spirit. So that book I recommend probably more than anything else.
Haidt's got 2 books coming out?
Yeah, his next one, I've corresponded with a few times trying to work with him on some different things. And he's like, look, my publisher has got me under lock and key. I know he's got one coming out on smartphones specifically. Yes. And I think he's making a lot of parenting, policy, public policy, school policy recommendations that'll be pretty significant. Age of consent, age of access, things like that. So it's going to be one of his major public policy recommendation books. I don't know what else he's working on. Maybe you know of something else.
Well, I saw an email. A friend invited him to speak somewhere, and he just sent me the email response, and it's like, I'm living in a cave.
Yeah, that's the same
Food
one.
is being slid under the door. I'm under 2 deadlines on 2 books.
Oh, is he okay?
Like, I will
I'll have to
not.
go check that.
I'm not even going to look at your email requests or whatever it is.
That's good.
What is on your nightstand? And I'm guessing you're going to say this book right here, yes, which I have not read more than a page of. I got it a couple days ago, but I'm looking forward to it. And you were the one. Your interview with Shapiro and Morrison sort of woke me up to who Morrison was, and now I'm like, how did I not know about this guy before?
It's amazing. Yeah, I sat there reading that book just last night, and there's something that just comes alive in me that never comes alive in the same way, except when I'm reading not just him, but the whole world of Russian literature and ideas that he opened up for me at Northwestern that he's done for generations.
So we should say, because people were saying, wait, who are we talking about? So the book is called Wonder Confronts Certainty.
Yeah.
Gary Saul Morrison, who is a professor at Northwestern, has huge classes.
Biggest classes on campus, absolutely.
So
reading through the Russian novels of the 19th century, Anna Karenina and the Brothers Karamazov.
I heard somebody interviewing him, and they said, I mean, they were almost in tears. They said, reading your book was one of the 2 or 3 most emotional reading experiences that I've ever had.
Was that this book they were talking about?
And they said, I just was so moved by it. And I can think of 2 or 3 times when reading a book has, I mean, I obviously couldn't relate to that. I haven't read this book, but I can think of 2 or 3 times in my life where reading something and it's like, oh, I've got to stop. I've got to go walk around the block. I've just got to sit and process what I am hearing. So I'm looking forward to reading the book.
Well, I have to constrain myself for the same reasons in there, but I had never seen him talk before about Vasily Grossman. Vasily Grossman is one of my favorite writers, the Russian writer, also Jewish, 20th century, was sort of like the Tolstoy of World War II. He's got 2 books, one called Life and Fate, another called Stalingrad, and they're both about the Stalingrad campaign, but they're more like War and Peace. I mean, that's what he was commissioned to do, not about the Napoleonic campaign of the 19th century, but the, German-Russian War and World War II Eastern Front. But that book, every which way, it's emotionally, it's hard to describe, but it's emotionally overwhelming. Mm-hmm. Like you're reading through this and you just cannot, you're reading just the letter from the Jewish mother to her son. You're seeing, the Germans build the gas chambers. You're walking into the chambers with a Jewish woman doctor and this little boy who's been separated. Like even just talking about it is so harrowing. But I think what it is about Morrison is that in an academic landscape that seems to be playing, he's dealing with like the most essential questions of life. Like, what is it for? What is truth? What is the good life? And students like me, generations of me, our lives have been transformed because he takes that seriously. It's not just this never-ending hermeneutic of suspicion that assumes that we have everything figured out at age 18 and we're just reading into the classics whatever we want to see in there and making our own truth. He's saying, no, you need to sit at the feet of the masters before you can learn how to do it yourself. So again, I got to contain myself, but I brought that book with me on this trip and I'm making my way through it.
And so then my last question, because we're out of time, what are you working on next?
So it's actually related. Part of what I was working on in Cambridge is a short book. Sounds ridiculous to say, but a short book responding to Elie Wiesel's critique in his book Night about the Holocaust, about the death of God, essentially. So I'm trying to connect that back to a lot of the insight of the Russian Christian writers about the meaning of life and all sorts of things like that. I'm tying it back into Isaiah 52, 53. But essentially, it's the Odyssey. It's the problem of evil. It's just looking at it narrowly through the question of the Holocaust, and specifically the moral revolution that was affected by the Holocaust. I learned this from some British scholars, but the basic idea is that in Western culture leading up to World War II, the most potent symbol of life was the cross. That was, we were all sort of judging ourselves based on how we compared to Jesus. But since World War II, the cross has lost a lot of its potency. The symbol that everybody talks about now is the swastika. And the moral revolution has flipped now that if you walk through your neighborhood in Lake Forest with a cross, people might look at you kind of funny and think, what are you doing? If you walk through your neighborhood with a swastika, that's a physical threat to people. So that just shows you how visceral that sort of moral revolution is. And it's affected how Christianity operates, because the criticism was Christians were gassing the Jews while they were worried about alcohol or dancing or etiquette and things like that. It would seem to be just this blow to the very credibility of Christianity that has never really quite been recovered from. And it's a basic idea of how could there ever possibly be a reason that God would allow something as horrific as this to happen. And now when you and I are talking with people in our cultures, back to cultural apologetics, what do they usually say to us? If you were to say, are you good enough to go to heaven? What do they say?
Better than Hitler.
Better than Hitler. There it is. That's new, as in since World War II. I'm better than Hitler.
Okay, Collin, I need to let you go because you got to get ready for tonight. So many more questions. Look forward. Hope to get you back after your next book or the next one, whatever, because there's so much to talk about. And maybe by then,
I'll have finished
we'll
it.
have finished, right?
Compare notes.
Wonder confronts certainty. So thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Mike.